Talk about history. I've been dying to talk about this. I just really wanted to make sure everyone understood like the underlying principles of planning that's been going on over here. Is there any way to hide this? Can't seem to hide it. That's pretty bad. How about okay? So they started off with the grid, which, as we all know, was started. This pattern of development was started by the Greeks. Let's say 300, not 300, maybe even earlier. Like how many thousand BC Greeks history? Three. Okay. Greek city history. I just really want to know what year that was. 8th century BC. So like 12th to 9th centuries BC. So let's say somewhere between, let's just say 11th century to be safe, that they already had the grid patterns in place. So 11th century all the way up to the Spanish, that's like 1600. So plus another 11 over here, let's say another 10. So 2,650 years of grid pattern development. It was tried, it's successful, and something we'll discuss later on. The reason why the grid pattern prevailed is because it was a very easy way to subdivide land, and it made it very fair for the owners. Oh, I have the same amount of land as you because it's square, easier to count, easier to measure, so easier to manage. And then there's a small fort here. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see it. There's a small triangular formation over here. That's Fort San Pedro, also known as Plaza Independencia. All Philippine cities had like some kind of fortification because during this time, there were still the kanang more Islamic raids from Mindanao. So to protect their Spanish colonies, the Spaniards erected fortifications. So this kind of pattern remained the same mostly from like 1600s until the Industrial Revolution, which we could probably imagine Cebu City spreading out more. Um, so starting out, this is the Colon area or Barangay Central, like what do you call this? Santo Niño area, the Cebu Metropolitan Cathedral area, basically our heritage district in Cebu City. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we had more industries. By the 1900s, another big leap was the invention of the car and also the train before that. The train came out, let's say, late 1800s, like 1880s or 1890s. And then a few decades later, the car was like invented like 1900s, something like that. So now we have the train line over here to the north, more inland of Cebu City. This connects, let me open up my Cebu City map. The now to the south, and I forgot what, no, the now to the north. And I think somewhere Naga to the south. So that was the 1910s, post-industrial revolution, and everything was going smoothly. We just got liberated from the Spanish. We got turned over to the Americans. We had a brief, like, sort of conflict with the Americans. We lost significantly because we didn't have the technology to fight against the Americans. And now we have the American occupation. Fortunately, the Americans were, what do you call this? Um, More advanced in city planning. So they applied their city planning principles basically based, basically based, basically based on the Garden Cities of Tomorrow, published by British planner Ebenezer Howard. Technically, he wasn't a planner, but he was thinking about um, public space planning policies before planners were actually a thing. And his goal with this document was really to clean up the urban areas because in London, in Britain, urban areas are becoming more polluted, and the idea of garden cities was to add more open space, um, reduce pollution because it was affecting the health of citizens in what do you call this 1900s London. And I forgot to mention the grid pattern was enforced by the laws of the Indies, basically a Spanish document telling colonizers how to build their colonies. Okay, so in the American occupation, this was a time that buildings like the Cebu City Capitol building was constructed, and then we had Fuente Osmeña Circle as well, and then everything was going smoothly up until World War II happened. And then there was a lot of destruction in the Philippines, which again necessitated a lot of reconstruction. And then the popular post-World War II Planning Act was sort of published by, again, British planners. This is the Town and Country Planning Act. Basically, this is the forerunner to the zoning ordinances of today. So you see here in red was the old or the original um, Cebu colony, and now it has expanded almost um, triple its size. So over here, you can see that's the Capitol building. That's Fuente Osmeña Circle over here with the big circle. And then our railway from Danao to Naga was destroyed in World War II. So that railway no longer exists. It's like been covered up by commercial buildings and roads. And then um, we had the 1970s, we had Marcos, all that corruption, etc., etc., up until 2005, about let's say 15 years ago. This was what Cebu looked like. So really, it's amazing to think that Cebu City being an island and we have like a sloping terrain, that even in such a small island, the urban sprawl occurred. Because typically urban sprawl happens when you have a huge plot of land, and then it should only happen in flat areas. But the prevalence of private vehicles, the popularity of like being able to go on your own in your car, really kind of what they call this encourage this kind of development pattern. So notice dead ends, a lot of subdivisions, a lot of minor roads that don't lead anywhere, and the grid pattern has could no longer be enforced because it was basically a free for all. The reason why it feels like there's no planning in Cebu City is really because there was no planning in Cebu City. We had one plan, the Metro Cebu Land Use and Transportation Plan, like MACLUTS. I'll make a module about this. And our former dean, architect Yumi Espina, was in charge of it together with the other Espinas. And the goal was to sort of manage this growth. Unfortunately, it wasn't implemented, or only parts of it got implemented before like a new president, a new mayor, etc. Stopped that implementation. That's why we ended up with the mess we're in now. Well, it's not a total mess, but it could have been a lot better had the political will been there in the 1990s and 1980s. But this is the challenge we have to face today. And I just want to highlight in this 1970s graph plan, there are some grid patterns here proposed by the Americans after World War II, but again, they weren't followed because of like so many like economic reasons. People were thinking short term, they weren't thinking long term. They were just like thinking about getting the money as soon as possible. So that created this pattern. Urban sprawl is very good like in the short term, like making small roads going dead end subdivision, but in the long term this is really what we're feeling now. So that's what we're trying to manage and regulate. So present day, the goal of urban planning is to focus on the environment, focus on the people, and remove the spotlight from private vehicles. So it sounds very socialist, very kind of almost communist, but that's really the problem of urban planning. We're not designing for a single group of individuals. We're designing for a whole city, a whole 900,000 people. And for it to work, for the plan to work, um, in most cases, the needs of the many have to be considered against the needs of the few, meaning we should plan in a way that more people are benefited and not just those who are in the upper 1%. Okay, there's really no way of not making it sound very socialist. And then just a summary over here. 1600s to 1800s. The goal of planning was for trade and fortification because there were a lot of like raids from rival tribes, etc. 1800s to 1900s, the goal was to manage overpopulation and clean up our cities because of the pollution, a lot of waste. So improvements in utilities. 1900s to 2000s. So the goal now is to like change human behavior or make cities adapt to actual human behavior. Don't force people into like private bubbles, which causes like the need for private vehicles, which causes traffic congestion, pollution, etc. All that stuff. So we need like a shift, a paradigm shift from planning for vehicles to planning for um, other forms of mobility, cycling, walking, mass transportation, etc. And then you have some references over here. You have the image of the Metro Cebu land use transportation plan. Metro land use, I think that's right. Maklots, Cebu. Let me just check if that was the correct. Let's see here. Just need to really make sure I have the Metro Cebu land use transportation study. So Metro Cebu land use transportation study. So that's what maklots mean. Okay, makluts. Okay, that's pretty much it. Expect a quiz on that to appear in probably in the coming week. So it'll be like a 5 question quiz just to make sure that you read it and you understood it. And then of course over here is the image for the green loop. Again, proposed by our former dean Yumi Espina, and then it's all about excuse me, creating like a transportation corridor that's not only for the moving of people, but also highlights a tourism zone, cultural districts, trade and financial centers, basically having destinations with meaning and like creating more utility for our public spaces versus just like a mode of like a corridor for transportation. So it's activating the public space and we're basically adding more use to our land. And that's a challenge because we don't have much land left in Cebu City. Okay, so that's it. Thank you. I'll stop recording here.